Okay, so I'm recording this meeting. You're going to get a little a pop-up coming onto your screen. You have to click it, otherwise it will not go away. This is the Global Language-Based Area Studies series. We have a strong focus on crisis this year, which is a school-wide theme. And we've been very, very fortunate to have Professor Jonathan Hopkins from the LSE here to speak to us. Andrew will introduce him properly in a moment. I'm just going to say a huge thank you to everyone for attending and to Elena, as always, for helping out in this process, and as well as Lael. Thank you for attending at such a busy time. There will be another seminar. I'll try to remember to mention it again on the 24th of March at the same time, 1:30, involving 4 PhD students doing methods papers, one of whom is indeed Elena. In terms of other things, I think I'll just remind you to try to put your questions into the Q&A box. But if you do end up putting your question in the chat box, we will try to pick up on them. You may not get your question answered. If you need to speak, say, for instance, you want to contest the point, then by all means do so. But we will need to unmute you to enable you to speak. So all questions will be written unless you request to be able to speak. And for that, you'll need to raise your hand. And on that note, I will leave and stop talking and pass you over to Andrew, who will introduce today's speaker. Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Gordon. Just to say how delighted we are then to have Professor Jonathan Hopkins from the London School of Economics with us today. It's really pleasing to have him and giving us a talk on, and I think something that's so topical and is going to continue to be really a theme for the following few years in the decade of the 2020s, this relationship between the market or capital, however you want to define things, and democracy. So Professor Jonathan Hopkins has been at the LSE since 2004. He's held a variety of visiting positions in Spain, Italy, and the United States of America, and his research, for which he's prolific scholar, has published on a range of parties and elections in Western Europe, particular focus on Italy, Spain, and the UK, and has usually worked on themes surrounding corruption, political finance, and the area of territorial politics. His latest research is on the emergence of party cartels in advanced democracies. And for those of you who may not know the term, simply put, a cartel party makes use of the resources of the state to maintain its position within the political system. But what Jonathan is going to be speaking to us today is, as I mentioned, a compelling, highly topical subject titled Anti-System Politics, the Crisis of Market Liberalism in Rich Democracies, which seeks to place anti-system politics within a larger history, really, of the open antagonism between capitalism and democracy. And just to, before I hand over to Jonathan, just as one reviewer noted, and I quote here, and then I'll pass it over. Hopkin has produced one of the most compelling reads of 2020, a book deserving of serious engagement and discussion by anybody interested in politics, philosophy, and economics. So I'll hand over now to our speaker.
Thank you, Andrew. And thanks for the invitation, and thanks to you all for being here. I was just thinking that review sounds like I might have written it. Are you sure you didn't get it from the blurb from the book?
No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't.
Okay, so I'm going to put some slides up. And while I'm doing that, okay, can you all see that? Great. I guess I'll start actually by just saying that this, I think, my very first presentation in a university, my very first invitation to give a paper at a university in Britain as an academic was at Cardiff, actually, back in the late 90s, when I was a lecturer in Birmingham. And I got invited over by Mark Donovan and David Broughton, I think it was, So yeah, this after a quarter of a century later, it's very nice to be invited back. This presentation is going to be based around my recently published book, Anti-System Politics: The Crisis of Market Liberalism in Rich Democracies. So what I'm going to really do in this presentation is walk you through the main arguments in the book. I guess in the hope that you might be interested enough to buy it, but also at the risk that you might think that you already know what's in it, and so won't bother to buy it. But yeah, I'm hoping to get some feedback from you about the arguments and see to what extent the case I'm making works and what kind of reaction that you can offer to it. So what does the book do? Well, it's about anti-system politics, and by that I mean the recent growth in political parties that are kind of seen as being outside the political establishment, particularly parties to the far right and to the radical left of the kind of mainstream parties, also parties that challenge the status quo and the sort of fundamental institutions that govern politics, the economy, and society more broadly. And I'm going to make the argument that this kind of politics is best understood as a natural outcome of the kind of inequalities and the insecurity that are generated by capitalism, but by the very specific type of what we could broadly call market liberalism or neoliberalism, which has dominated the way we govern our economies in the last 2 or 3 decades. I also think that the financial crisis of the late noughties was a significant catalyst or accelerator of trends that were, however, already in place prior to that. So I'm kind of saying that political instability and polarization that we're seeing at the moment is very much the result of a particular way of organizing capitalism and a response to some of the bad effects that type of capitalism has. So what the book does, it walks you through the kind of history of the conflict between democracy and capitalism, as Andrew was alluding to. I also teach a course on the Master's Program in Comparative Politics at LSE called Capitalism and Democracy, and the whole point of this course is to integrate the extent to which capitalism and democracy can coexist, whether they're consistent with each other. The book takes a mixed methods approach, so I combine some quantitative analysis, sort of basically looking at the vote shares that anti-system parties get, how that evolves over time, how it varies across countries. But I also complement that with a series of case studies. So there are chapters on the US, obviously the main focus there being Trump, the UK, again, focused largely on Brexit, but there are other forms of anti-system politics that are worthy of note in the UK. Also looking at the politics of the Eurozone, and I have chapters on Spain and Italy too. And these are all, actually, as it turns out, countries which combine both a significant high level of anti-system politics and the fact that they are countries that I'm very familiar with. So I guess the sort of the advantage or curse that I have in studying anti-system politics is that the countries I'm most familiar with are most afflicted by it. So what is anti-system politics, and what is the system that anti-system politics is against? And I guess, I mean, some of you will be familiar with the sort of the scholarship on Western European politics and party politics in particular, and might be familiar with this notion that the sort of established democracies of Western Europe and North America have long been dominated by a kind of fairly stable type of party system representing similar ideological traditions in different countries. And this stability, when I first started studying party politics, which is like uncomfortably long time ago now, we were still kind of working on the assumption that party politics was quite stable, that as Lipset and Roccan, in a very famous quote from a book published in 1967, argued the contemporary party systems, they're of course talking of the party systems of the 60s, reflect with few significant exceptions the cleavage structures of the 1920s. And they went on to say that the party alternatives are older than the majorities of the national electorates. Now, of course, to some degree, this is still true in most democracies. So the main parties in America, Republicans and Democrats, have been dominating American politics for at least a century. Labour and Conservatives remain the most important political parties in Britain. Labour is over a century old, Conservatives even older. So to some extent this is true, but I'm about to argue that in many ways this claim no longer stands up. Now, the other point about these party systems, not only were they stable, but they tended to consist of the same kinds of parties. So there were these kind of party families that became entrenched in the party system. And these party families were usually had a party of the kind of Labour, social democratic, socialist tradition. You would have usually a kind of conservative, mainstream conservative party. You would usually, or very often at least in Europe, have a Christian democratic party. You'd have liberal parties. These families tended to be present in most Western democratic systems. So anti-system parties in that context, and the term was originally coined by Giovanni Sartori, an Italian political scientist writing in the 60s. He was mainly talking about communist and neo-fascist parties, which were the only parties which were kind of outside the establishment of political parties committed to liberal democracy. And these parties were excluded from the normal patterns of coalition formation, government formation, and were therefore best considered anti-system parties because they didn't want to participate in the system. They were fundamentally opposed to it. Now, over time, what Lipset and Roccan were claiming became less and less true. So these traditional parties, they retained usually the name. In some cases they changed, but most of the time the parties that were around in the 60s are still around now. Germany currently dominated by the CDU, Christian Democratic Union. That was also the main party of government in Germany in the 1960s. As I said here, Labour and the Conservatives. So in most countries, the same parties are there, but the point is that they no longer reflect, or at least prior to the rise of anti-system parties, no longer really reflected distinctive ideological traditions. So around sometime in the 90s, I remember this becoming aware that this was happening, but I can't put a date on exactly when it became a thing. But at some point we started talking about socialist or social democratic or Labour parties as being the center left and conservatives or Christian Democrats being the center right. The implication being that really the only choice you had in democratic elections in Western Europe and in the Americas was between different tinges, if you like, of centrism. This is what Katzenmeier described, and Andrew mentioned this in the introduction, as a party system cartel, which meant that these parties were kind of colluding either implicitly or in some cases openly to protect their own positions in the party system, to repel outsiders, and in a later iteration of the debate on party cartels, Mark Blyth and Dick Katz argued that this cartel was not just about protecting the existing parties, but it was also a cartel around a particular set of ideas. Those ideas being what we could broadly call market liberalism, as implied in the subtitle of my book. So what do we mean by this market liberalism? Well, we mean that on the key issues of economic policy in particular, and there are differences on other kinds of policies in this period, but on the kind of key bread and butter economic and social policy issues, main parties no longer competed, at least no longer presented really distinct alternatives. So all the major established parties in Western countries were in favor of free trade rather than protectionism of their markets. They were all in favor of independent central banks to set interest rates, and usually doing so with a specific target to achieve low levels of inflation. There was an idea that markets should be less and less tightly regulated. So there should be, to the extent possible, free open markets in which the price mechanism regulated where resources went. And there was also a concern to reduce fiscal deficits, to make sure that governments were not borrowing too much, and to possibly push fiscal policy into a commitment to balance budgets. So by the 2000s, by the noughties, the traditional parties were, on the one hand, converging around this vision of how capitalism works, and on the other, losing ground. And new political parties, those that I'm defining here as anti-system, were emerging instead and eating into the traditional parties' support base. So I guess this was becoming visible already quite a while back, and particularly in the early part of the last decade, became fairly obvious that anti-system politics was on the rise. I think a lot of people started to notice it, in particular around the middle of the decade, when we had strong electoral showings from parties like the Front National in France, but then, of course, in particular, the successes of Donald Trump and the Leave vote in the UK really representing a sea change, really, in our politics. And because these political movements were all essentially movements of the right, in which opposition to open borders, opposition to migration were particularly a fundamental part of the discourse, there's been a tendency to see anti-system politics as being about immigration, cultural change, racism, xenophobia, and so on. So this is what some people call the cultural backlash thesis, associated with a number of scholars here: Rhetoric, Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart, Matt Goodwin, and others. And the basic idea being that what's happened is, as globalization has proceeded and you get increasing movements of people around the world, increasing shares of the population who are recent migrants, this sparks a backlash amongst more conservative or closed-minded people who resent the imposition of cultural diversity, they resent progressive values, and they see the cartel parties who have converged around these centrist positions as being too soft on immigration and not being willing to protect traditional values, and therefore they turn to the far right, parties like Le Pen's, or in the case of Britain, UKIP, as the best way to defend this anti-migration position. And there's some evidence to suggest that the cultural backlash thesis has something going for it, mainly that voters for the far right tend to have, indeed, we can see from survey data, quite strongly culturally conservative attitudes and show a high level of anxiety about immigration. So it seems, pretty strong case. The voters voting for the far right don't like immigration. The support of the far right is increasing as migration becomes a more salient political issue. So there we have it. Anti-system politics is about immigration. However, as you might have guessed, I don't really buy this. Now, of course, it's true that if we look at the sample of anti-system right-wing politicians here, so we have Trump and Farage, we have Wilders in the Netherlands, we have Orban in Hungary, Le Pen in France, and I've forgotten her name already, the woman from the AfD who's already resigned, Frauke, was it? Anyway, they all definitely represent hostility to migration. There's a common pattern. They use derogatory terms about migrants and asylum seekers, and migration is at the center of their appeal. But at the same time, there are a number of politicians who are also coming from outside the system. Equally, if not more successful in some cases, who are not espousing an anti-immigration or xenophobic line at all. And so obviously Corbyn, notwithstanding accusations of anti-Semitism, can't really be suggested to be representing xenophobic political programs. Similarly, Bernie Sanders in the US, elected Tsipras in Greece, represented a radical left alternative to austerity in Greece and won power in 2015. Pablo Iglesias, Podemos in Spain, now vice president of the government in Spain. Again, I don't think ever has been heard advocating particular restrictions on migration or expressing any hostility to migrants. And Beppe Grillo, the Italian comedian who founded the Five Stars movement in the top left corner there, is a bit more ambiguous about migration, but generally speaking, it is not at the core of the Five Stars movement's appeal. So what's going on? If it's about migration, why are we seeing anti-system parties that don't like migration and anti-system parties that at the very least don't have a problem with it rising at the same time? So, I argue in the book that the weakness of the cultural thesis on anti-system politics is it can't really explain why left anti-system parties should be doing well at the same time as those on the right are doing well. It also can't explain patterns of geographical support for these different parties. So the anti-migrant right tends to perform best in areas of relatively low migration, which in itself suggests that there's at the very least not a linear relationship between migration and anti-migrant attitudes. Now, one of the reasons for that, of course, is that low levels of migration and high levels of support for the far right tend to be correlated with economic and demographic decline. So my colleague at LSE, Andres Rodriguez Posse, who's an economic geographer, wrote a piece in 2018 called The Revenge of the Places That Don't Matter. And in that paper and subsequent research, he showed that actually economic decline was a far stronger predictor of votes for the radical right than levels of migration. So if it's not migration, what is it? Well, my argument that I tried to develop in the book, and I will try and make for you now in the time left to me, is that, what we are seeing is actually not really a cultural backlash as such, but a backlash against an economic and political system that increases economic inequality and insecurity, whilst at the same time closing off channels of political participation so that voters feel increasingly frustrated that voting for the established parties will do nothing to solve the problems they identify. So what are these anti-system politicians? Exactly, I showed you some pictures of examples of these politicians. What do they actually talk about? Well, they pretty much all universally are hostile to the cartel, to the established parties. And they often use the language, some of them even use the word cartel often. So in Italy and Spain, the phrase la casta, the caste, has been used to describe the political class. So there's resentment towards the establishment in general, the existing political elite. But they also leverage resentment towards the consequences of market liberal or neoliberal policies. So they very often invoke inequality, insecurity, increasing austerity in government spending after 2010 or so, and stagnating living standards. Because, I'm guessing a good bunch of my audience are students, so you're a bit younger than I am, and you probably don't have much experience of living in a world where economic growth is higher. Living standards have been pretty much stuck in the UK on average over the last decade. Most people are barely any better off than they were before the global financial crisis of 2008. But prior to that, it was pretty normal for living standards to rise. So there's a lot of resentment stemming from the fact that people feel economically stuck or even worse off than they were in the past. And on top of that, you've got the fact that the financial crisis was not only a disaster for the economy, but it also revealed the fact that wealthy elites, which in many ways could be blamed for the financial crisis, were actually the first to be bailed out by governments. And then on top of that, the consequences were mostly felt through austerity measures, which were targeted at lower income groups. Now, this anti-system rhetoric is fairly universal across all of these, both right and left-wing variants, but of course there are differences between the two. So just to go through what I mean by anti-system right and anti-system left, the right tend to emphasize, as I said before, open borders, immigration, but also trade. So Trump in particular was very vocal about the ways in which globalization, trade liberalization had exposed American workers to downward pressure on their wages. But Brexit in some ways makes similar arguments, even though the agenda of trade liberalization is confusingly still part of Brexit rhetoric. There's also hostility to what I could basically use the shorthand of people like us, the liberal elite of people like university professors who impose politically correct attitudes on everyone. The current debate on freedom of speech in the UK is a pretty good example of that. Also, there's welfare chauvinism, a tendency to argue that migration is making the welfare state unsustainable and we're not looking after our own people first. This is also very, very common in right-wing anti-system rhetoric. And finally, the financial crisis revealing that governments were not really concerned for the interests of the people they represented, and instead were more worried about protecting the interests of global capital. Now, on the left, we have a very different way of interpreting this crisis. It is broadly an anti-capitalist or anti-neoliberal interpretation of what's gone wrong. So it's the argument that the market system is working for the wealthy, and governments need to step in to ensure that it works for everyone, to curb market forces and ensure that markets are organized in such a way that that living standards can grow for all, not just for an elite at the top. So again, there's anti-elitism there, but the elite we're talking about is a different one. There's opposition to austerity, predictably enough, and also opposition to some labour market reforms that have made precarious work more and more common, especially for younger people. Finally, there's in countries in the Eurozone, there is hostility to the euro, but not necessarily hostility to the European Union or European integration as an idea per se. So hostility to freedom of movement in the European Union is pretty much restricted to pre-Brexit UK. There's very little, very little emphasis on freedom of movement seen as a problem in most of the European countries, and immigration is not really seen as a problem at all on the radical left. So if you're interested in the data, this is, I'll just skip over this, but if you're interested, we can talk about it more. If you use, there are various kinds of data we can use to identify where political parties stand on different issues. And a very typical way of doing this is to draw a scatter plot in which you place a party at the intersection between points on two dimensions. One is the state market economy divide between left and right, and the other is the kind of social cultural divide between more progressive or more conservative or socially authoritarian attitudes. And so what you see there is here, if you look on the left-hand side of the chart, you see the cartel or establishment parties are all kind of congregated with a few exceptions around the center there. A broadly centrist position, both on the economy and on cultural attitudes. But if you look at the right-hand side, what I've done there is I've located on this, two-dimensional space the anti-system parties. And you can see there is a kind of distinction between those occupying a more right-wing position on social cultural values and those a more left-wing position. But also it's notable that the left anti-system parties are more left-wing than the cartel parties on economic policy issues. And the right-wing anti-system parties, this group at the top here, are not on a left-wing position, but they're in less of a right-wing position than kind of established conservative parties are. So you can see that anti-system parties are all shoving the political center of gravity on economic policy issues towards the left, but on social cultural issues, they have diametrically opposed positions. So I guess what have I got left? About 15 minutes. So what is the evidence for my argument that neoliberalism or these kind of pro-market reforms that we've seen over the last 30, 40 years, what is the evidence that they explain the rise of anti-system politics? Well, first of all, there's actually a lot of work in economic history that shows that financial crises and recessions or depressions tend to lead to conflict and populism. So, you know, the 1930s being the obvious and disastrous example of that. So inequality is seen as increasing social tension and increasing demands for redistribution. Obvious reason being that if the pie is getting smaller, you're going to have more of a fight over who gets a bigger slice of the pie. It's easier to solve arguments about who gets what when the pie is growing. The pie is no longer growing. In some cases, it's shrinking. So that makes people angry with each other. Financial crises also create insecurity because they sort of undermine the very basis of what we think a capitalist economy is supposed to rest on. People don't trust money anymore. They don't trust markets. They don't trust banks to protect your savings. And there's a lot of resentment about who's to blame for the massive financial losses that the world has undergone in the last decade or so. So this again creates social tension, conflict over distributive issues. Now, if you add to that the fact that this party cartel has been unable to really express these conflicts and tensions, it's hardly surprising, therefore, that you would get a backlash against establishment politics, because you have a very serious economic crisis and you have an apparent inability of established politicians to do anything about it. So again, to repeat the argument already made, it's not necessarily anything to do with immigration as such. So what we see, the evidence for this is that in a way we're going through a rerun, happily so far less violent, of the 1930s. So anti-system voting and electoral instability has risen since the financial crisis. Inequality is a very good predictor of high levels of anti-system voting. The severity of the financial crisis in each country is correlated with both inequality and anti-system politics. And anti-system parties, as I just showed, are most likely to invoke interventionist measures to curb markets and address the failings of neoliberalism. So here's a bit of data on that. First of all, timing of instability. This rather messy chart here shows you what's happened to the level of predictability of elections over the post-war period in 21 democracies, basically Western Europe and a couple of others. And what you can see is that the number of high volatility elections, and that means elections in which a large share of the electorate on net has changed their vote compared to the previous one, there's a very definite uptick in the 2010s and some very, very high volatility elections in which, between a third and a half of the electorate on net has changed their vote. And very often they've changed the vote not just between establishment parties. So, in Britain, that would be 2010, people are angry at the government because of the financial crisis. They don't vote Labour, they vote Conservative. But there's another way you can respond, especially after voting Conservative doesn't seem to help things because they introduced austerity measures, the economy was depressed, the recovery was slow. And so a lot of people in 2015, rather than voting Labour or Conservative, they would vote instead for an anti-system party. In Britain, the most successful of those were UKIP, which won around 12% of the vote in 2015, and the Scottish Nationalists were the other main beneficiaries. In other European countries, similar patterns. In France, for example, Sarkozy, Conservative, was in charge at the time of the financial crisis in 2012, I think it was. François Hollande, the socialist candidate, won the presidential election. Very little changed after he was elected. He was so unsuccessful and so unpopular, he didn't even stand again. And in 2017 or 18, I can't remember which, we ended up with a battle between Marine Le Pen, very right-wing anti-system politician, and Emmanuel Macron, centrist, but again, a complete outsider. So you can see that anti-system voting, on average, very sharply accelerates after 2010, and the timing of that straight after the global financial crisis is very indicative of what I've been saying. But not only that, this is particularly the case in countries with high levels of inequality. So this awkward-looking scatter plot here gives you, on the horizontal axis, we have the Gini coefficient of inequality just before the financial crisis, and then we have the peak anti-system vote share on the vertical axis. And that means the countries which have had sort of the highest high watermark of anti-system voting, which are Italy, Greece, the UK, with Brexit, and the US with Trump. And you can see these are all high inequality countries. Lower inequality countries on the bottom left of this chart had much lower levels of anti-system voting in the 2010s. And you can also see a correlation between how far median income, average incomes dropped after the financial crisis and this peak anti-system vote share. Again, Greece being the spectacular case, of course, but also Italy, Spain, Ireland, and Portugal were countries with the biggest median income falls, and all of those, and especially Italy and Greece, had very high shares of anti-system voting. So, final part of the argument that I'm going to try and make is that not only is the timing of anti-system politics indicative of issues of how capitalism is organized being at the heart of all of this, but also variations in anti-system voting across countries tell us a lot about not only how much anti-system voting you could expect to see in a given place, but also which types of anti-system parties are going to do best in different countries. Because as we've gone through the differences between anti-system right and left parties, you can see that they tend to appeal to different kinds of voters, because not all kinds of voters are equally likely to respond favorably to these different appeals. So the kind of socially conservative, pro-capitalist but anti-globalization and anti-migration rhetoric of the radical right is more likely to succeed, and we know this from survey data, is more likely to succeed amongst less educated voters, and to some extent also amongst older voters and those living in more rural or suburban contexts. Similarly, the appeal of the left, which is anti-capitalist but socially liberal, is more likely to appeal to more educated voters, younger voters, and voters who live in a more urban setting. And this seems to be reproduced across most of the countries that I've been able to study. So we can use this to help us understand why different parties do better in different places. So, and the main reason why we see the variations we do is that there are kind of two dimensions of variation. One is, how bad is the financial crisis? How protected are voters by effective welfare institutions? How likely is it that people take a hammering after the financial crisis? So there we can see some countries offer a lot of protection, others far less, but also there are differences between which groups welfare states protect. So I'm using a kind of well-established typology of welfare states, Esping Anderson's 3 worlds of welfare capitalism typology, some of you may know about. And if we divide up the countries we're looking at here into a kind of liberal Anglo-Saxon group, a kind of Northern European social market economy type of group, and a Southern European group, we can see that the combination of how exposed they were to the financial crisis and what kind of welfare state they had gives us a reasonably strong prediction of what kind of anti-system politics they're going to have and to what extent voters are going to turn to anti-system parties. And so this is kind of detailed in this table here, in which I kind of map out different 6 kind of different scenarios, really. So you can have, we have these 3 types of welfare states, and we have a bunch of countries, mainly in continental Northern Europe, with very strong welfare states, but also had less severe crises for reasons I could talk about in Q&A, but I don't have time to do now. So in these places, you do have an anti-system reaction, but it is more limited, and the center or established parties are able to hang on to power. So this would be typical of countries such as in Scandinavia, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, France, Austria. The dominant anti-system parties in these countries tend to be on the right. And the reason for this is that these are countries with a less severe crisis and stronger welfare states, but their welfare states have been pared back in ways that are most likely to expose those voters more likely to vote for right-wing parties. In other words, less educated voters, and especially older voters. Then we have 2 kinds of countries, which I call here debtor countries because of the role of levels of debt in explaining how severe the crisis was after 2008. And here we have kind of 2 broad kinds. We have what I call here the dualistic welfare state, which is typical of Southern Europe. These countries had high inequality and a very severe crisis, but because of the nature of their welfare state being very protective of older and more protected types of workers, the kind of workers that in Northern Europe might be more likely to vote for right-wing parties, these kinds of voters don't tend to support anti-system parties and stay with the established parties. So the sort of channel for right-wing anti-system politics is closed off by the nature of how the costs of the crisis are distributed. On the other hand, The group that isn't well protected at all in the Southern European welfare state is the young, younger voters, women, migrants, and any group which tends not to enjoy the kind of labour market and welfare protections of these older, usually male voters. And so that's why the anti-system impetus in Southern Europe tends to come from the left. So that's Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece, Five Stars Movement in Italy, although there are also some right-wing parties there too. And these left-wing forces have been able to actually enter the government in Greece, Portugal, Italy, and Spain. So a much stronger anti-system reaction. Then finally, we have the liberal group, or the Anglo-Saxon countries that I was talking about. This is what Esping Anderson and others call a residual welfare state. So we have, much more limited welfare protections. Inequality is very high, and the crisis was very severe. And in this case, actually, because unlike Southern Europe, there's no group that is particularly well protected by the welfare state, there's a very large pool and very diverse pool of voters that could respond to an anti-system appeal. So you actually get anti-system movements on both the left and the right. And in fact, in both cases, the anti-system right did successfully take over the system. In the UK with Brexit, which although it's been a conservative government all through this period, it's obviously a very different kind of conservative government now than the one that David Cameron led. And in the US, of course, Trump's presidency. But at the same time, and obviously there's a lot of focus on Brexit and Trump as being very dramatic manifestations of anti-system politics, we really shouldn't forget there have been very powerful left anti-system movements in these two countries too. In the UK, very obviously Corbyn's takeover of the Labour Party, very much a hard push of the party to the left, but also the success of Scottish nationalists in pushing for independence also reflects an anti-system impulse. And of course, in the US, what we see is the very, very strong showing, not enough to win the nomination, but twice over we had very strong backing for Bernie Sanders' openly socialist political program, which in the US, being a socialist, used to be quite the taboo, and yet Sanders has been very influential in politics over the last few years. But also we have movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too representing, albeit outside formal politics, representing, again, very left anti-system options. Okay, just a little bit of data to nail the argument before I wrap up. So the claims I'm making is that anti-system voting has tended to be most significant in countries with severe crises and weak welfare states. And so you can see here, anti-system voting has been rising in the blue line, the red line, well, red, more like purple, I think, is the Nordic and continental countries. So these kind of quite generous social protections and less severe financial crisis meant that the rise was relatively gradual. But in the southern countries, the orange line there, and the liberal countries, which in this case is just Ireland and Britain, the green line, we also see we see a much sharper increase, albeit from lower levels, in anti-system voting after the crisis, which reflects the predictions of the table. But also you can see that if we divide countries up into creditor countries and debtor countries, and I can go into more detail in Q&A about what I mean by creditors and debtors, but essentially creditor means you survive the crisis intact, debtor means you have a terrible crisis and severe strains. The creditor countries had a little bit of a rise in anti-system right voting as predicted by my framework, very little growth in anti-system left politics. But in the debtor countries, which is in this case Southern Europe, UK and Ireland, it's the opposite. You see a very dramatic increase in anti-system left voting and a much less dramatic increase in anti-system right voting. So the chair will tell me how much time I got left. I could talk a bit more about the cases, but I think I probably need to wrap up. We can probably, I've mentioned some of the arguments in this case study section during my presentation, so I think I'll just skip through it and get right to the conclusions to leave a bit of time for questions. So essentially, what am I arguing here? I'm arguing that what this is really all about, what the destabilization of party politics in the rich democracies of Western Europe and North America in particular, what explains this destabilization is what I could broadly describe as marketization or liberalization, this push ever since really the 70s to a much more market-oriented society in which exposure to economic and financial risks has been rising significantly. And there are plenty of both historical and theoretical reasons to expect anti-system or radicalization or polarization of politics to be the consequence of that. The more markets are threatening society's values, the more social and political conflict you can expect to have. Inequality and the depth of the financial crisis turn out to be pretty good predictors of anti-system party success, and that tends to reaffirm the argument that the more you have a market society, the more conflict will result. But I also add a refinement to that argument, which is that types of welfare state and labour market institutions tend to determine which groups are most exposed to crisis, and therefore which kinds of anti-system parties are most likely to exploit the situation. And just to wrap it up, what the implications of this are. What do we do to sort out this situation, if indeed you think we need to? If we have conflict resulting from an excessive reliance on market forces to decide who gets what in society, we need democracy to produce governments that actually cushion society from these forces. So government needs to do something about inequality, it needs to do something about insecurity, it needs to design welfare and labor market and financial market institutions to protect the groups that have been made anxious by recent changes. And just to conclude, my final point is that there is no back to normal available. Any attempt to return to the cartel politics of the pre-crisis situation are doomed to generate more instability and conflict. And I'll stop there. Thanks for listening.
I just want to say a huge thank you to you, Jonathan, for a superb talk. We're looking at the questions and people have been so stunned by your talk that they have lost their capacity to type. So what I might do is I might ask Andrew, do you have any comments or a question on that? I've got a couple of questions I can ask, but you're more of more of the themes that you're interested in came up, and then I might start.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's probably not an area that you've examined in great depth. I wonder how things map out in East European societies. Just any sort of thoughts, comments, observations on Eastern Europe in the past sort of 20, 30 years?
Yeah, that's a good point. And a few people have picked up on the absence of an East Central European perspective here. And I got to admit, really, that I don't think I know enough about these countries to be able to. I've stuck to countries I was familiar with, and there is always a risk in doing that. It's, selecting on the dependent variable, I suppose. I think the argument can be made to work. I mean, one of the problems is that I was particularly trying to explain the deterioration of what used to be a very stable pattern of party competition in Western Europe and elsewhere. Because in the former communist countries of Eastern and Central Europe, there's never really been a stable pattern of party competition that could be threatened. It's always been a high volatility environment with lots of frequent changes, not only in vote shares, but also in party names changing, factions leaving one party and forming another, and so on and so on. So it's very hard to actually document anti-system politics in the same way in those countries. But what I would say is that these countries in a way are a laboratory for what happens if you expose a population to extreme forms of market liberalism over a short period of time. These countries were removed from communism and thrown into, with some variations, but in some cases very extreme forms of kind of neoliberal market systems with very few welfare institutions to protect them. And the consequences of that were catastrophic losses in income, but also, huge social problems, rise in alcoholism, huge rise in mortality, especially I think in Russia, there was, incredible collapse of male life expectancy in particular. So I think the argument certainly is important, but I just didn't really have the time or the energy to include it in the book.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I suggest, Elena, we've had a question come in. Do you want to read it out?
Yes, Samuel Young asks, could you talk a bit more about how you measure the parties on social economic views scale? I wonder, as I've often found in my own research, that far-right parties don't tend to elaborate on economic policy in their rhetoric beyond a general protectionism / anti-liberalism.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think the chart I drew on the manifestos project data, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which for those of you who don't know this data, it's basically a way of measuring how many right or left-wing statements on particular dimensions are present in party manifestos. There's a massive data set of all the party manifestos of all the significant parties and all of the European countries and some others since the Second World War. So the good thing about that data set is there are lots of data points, which means you can see patterns. The bad thing about it is I'm not sure it really captures party positions as accurately as it could. It's just that the errors I think wash out the larger number of data points you have. The other one I drew on quite a lot was the Chapel Hill Expert Survey, which is basically party locations that, as perceived by political scientists. So an email comes around, then if you got one, Andrew, where would you locate this party in this country you study on these different dimensions? And they pool all these responses, and you get a location from there. I think these tend to be more accurate, but you don't have as long a data series. So I think both of these have a bit of the problem that you identify, the questioner identified, that if right-wing parties want to talk about immigration all the time and don't really have any particular plan for the economy, then it's hard to know exactly what their economic policy position is. And I think, and there are also some ambiguities. I'm making a claim here that right-wing populist or anti-system parties are tending to argue for a more protectionist approach to economic policy. But at the same time, if you actually listen to what Nigel Farage and others on the sort of Brexit right in Britain say, they claim to be in favour of free trade, even though actually the short-run effect of Brexit is quite the opposite of free trade. It's very obviously protectionist in its effect, but the rhetorical the rhetoric behind Brexit is very much about global Britain and so on. So actually, in a way, it's very clever because it means that they can kind of, on the one hand, gain votes from protectionism, but on the other hand, claim that they don't represent that at all. So you're quite right. There are huge problems really identifying what these parties really stand for. But at the bottom line is, if you're arguing that migration should be restricted on the grounds that the welfare state can't cope and it drives down low-skilled wages, then that is a protectionist position and it's about curbing the power of markets. So as far as I'm concerned, that is a position that we could locate as being, on the kind of right-wing protectionism part of the scale.
Thank you, Jonathan. We're still waiting for a few more questions. I'm expecting Nick Parsons, a question. He always asks a question. But in the meantime, anyway, I'll make a couple of comments. One is completely outside of Europe. When we're talking about anti-system parties, sometimes we really do mean anti-system parties. I mean, I'm thinking of the FIS in Algeria, whose election platform was to have no more elections after they'd got elected. And similarly, the same might have been said of the Muslim Brotherhood. But I suppose my two questions, neither of which is really fair, actually, or perhaps particularly pertinent. One is that you're looking at systems and so on, but what I'm wondering about is the way in which people within those systems are a factor. So the extent to which they ride the wave better. So you might well say, well, Nigel Farage was as soon as he left UKIP collapsed, but there are other reasons why UKIP collapsed and so on. But the role of agency in this whole combating of the system. And in the other one, which is a very unfair question, because I'm not sure when your book was published, but how is COVID going to shape this anti-system? Do you have any idea how the cards are going to land on the deck in the wake of COVID, certainly in Western Europe?
Yeah, very good questions both. I mean, to go backwards, the book was published first in the US in March 2020. So, and I finished writing it in June 2019. So yeah, I mean, I guess what the pandemic has mainly meant for this book is my inability to actually go around giving talks in person, trying to promote it, and so I'm on Zoom instead, which has saved me a lot of time, but might have cost me a bit of audience. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point. And to be honest, I'm kind of like, I'm sure all you are, so rushed off my feet. I have hardly time to think about it. And I started off thinking, wow, this is so interesting. What's it all going to mean? But after a few months, I just stopped saving interesting things I'd read on COVID. Just went into survival mode. I mean, we're going to have a lot of very big choices to make when this is over. If we're going to be optimistic and say that we should be over sort of the worst of it by the summer, then just like in 2009, really, very similar dynamic. You know, when we were in the midst of the financial crisis, I'm sure any students present don't remember this, but I'm sure you do, that, you know, those initially a point, how are we going to stop the whole system from collapsing? And governments threw everything they possibly could at it, right? But then as soon as the immediate danger was over and it looked like the banking system could, you know, pretty much survive, then how quickly can we get back to normal? And I think, you know, that error, I think, is the main reason why, you know, the things I'm describing in the book happened. Will we make the same mistakes again is the big question, especially since actually the level of damage to the economy and the level of government support that's been necessary is even bigger, right? And the debt levels we're going to be ending up with are, you know, on top of high levels of debt we already had as a result of the global financial crisis, because austerity didn't actually really reduce the overall amount of debt at all. They just stopped it rising. You know, the numbers are mind-boggling. Now, I can't help but think that this changes the debate entirely. There's no way we're getting back to debt being 40% of GDP as it was just before the financial crisis in Britain. No way in a million years is that going to happen in the next couple of decades. Unless we have, you know, a lot of inflation, which at the moment, everything points towards there being no inflation in the immediate future. So we're left with a lot of choices. What do we do with this new fiscal space that governments seem to have? Because I don't know how carefully you all follow this, but government has high debt levels since the early 60s, no real economic growth, and it can sell treasury bonds to the markets at pretty much zero interest rates. That seems to be an invitation for the government to borrow more and more and more money. And then they have the question of how are you going to spend that money? Well, the obvious thing to do is to use that money to support the people most damaged by first the crisis and then by the pandemic. And, you know, we were already seeing with Biden, massive stimulus package, the first signs that there is some intention to do that. Even the European Union, famous for its austerity, is rolling out, you know, hundreds of billions of euros of support for the Eurozone economy. So I hope this is a game changer, that we're basically throwing out most of what was this consensus around market liberalism that I'm describing from the 90s and noughties. I think that is all gone. yeah, I could go on, but I'd probably start to ramble. But I think something fundamental has changed there. I mean, in terms of the other question, which is very intriguing, because I never really expected there to be an attempted coup in the United States. I mean, you know, I've never been optimistic about Donald Trump's commitment to democracy, but I really didn't expect that. So I think, you know, I don't really talk too much in the book about whether or not anti-system politics is a threat to democracy. I'm mainly just trying to explain why parties resort to voting for anti-system, why voters rather resort to voting for anti-system parties. But I think there are serious questions. Obviously, far-right politicians in Hungary and Poland have, you know, really attacked democratic institutions. I think on a much softer scale, the government here has done so too, and very, very obviously Trump, at the very least with his rhetoric, because Trump, unlike here where we don't have a constitution to protect us, at least, you know, Trump was very restricted, I think, by features of the American Constitution, separation of powers and so on. But even so, you know, undermining the bedrock of democracy, which is, you know, when you lose, you leave office. This is all very serious. And I think, you know, when I started the talk, I tried to point out that there's this parallel with the 1930s. I was inspired a lot by the work of Karl Polanyi, The Great Transformation in particular, which describes how, you know, this insistence on trying to shoehorn society into an economic system based on market forces was always going to lead to disasters, because people would resist. And the way in which they resisted would not necessarily be democratic and would not necessarily be respectful of human rights. And this has always been my fear this last decade. But in the end, I never quite believed we would see what we saw on January the 6th. So I think, you know, it's a very, very serious matter. You know, can democracy survive? How committed are people to democratic procedures? You know, when people get desperate, they want desperate measures. Desperate measures can include suspending democracy. So yeah, we need to watch out.
That's a really good answer, a great answer. But I'm still looking for questions to come in. I'm not sure if people have
Nick
worked
has
it.
his
Oh,
hand
Nick
up,
has.
so
Great. Could you?
I'll open his mic now.
Yeah, good. Nick, you need to. Yep, well done.
Okay. Thanks, Jonathan, for a fantastic talk. It was really fascinating, and about a million questions were going through my head as you were talking, actually. But I have to go and see my children, and so I've only got about 15 minutes to be here. So I'm going to try and keep my questions short. And I'm afraid once you've answered, I'm going to hang up and leave. So I do apologise for that.
No worries.
But COVID is ruining all of our lives, not just on an aggregate political level. But I was wondering about talking about it's not a sort of, the rise of populism can't be ascribed to cultural backlash. But I wonder there, one of the things that social scientists, political scientists have measured countries on is also the amount of consensus within society, and whether that can be also a way of predicting, if you like, the extent of anti-establishment voting in various societies. And I wonder if you looked at that. It does seem to me that, you know, on the one hand, you've got the Nordics, low down, but also feeding into this historical contingency, I suppose, where if you look at France and the rise of Le Pen, there was already a strong far-right party that was actually growing from the early 1980s, 25 years before financial crisis. And really before that liberal experiment was beginning to bear its fruits in terms of the second effects that it was going to have on societies. So then, you know, the French National Front is starting to grow before these things, and indeed it was very much an anti-immigrant party in its inception, and took on to broaden its appeal, if like wider socio-economic concerns, particularly under Marine Le Pen. So that shift is actually quite recent, and it was very much a cultural backlash party, if you want. The UK is very different, where you've got UKIP, and obviously in terms of, you know, the last points about democratic threat, I think are quite pertinent here as well, where you have that robust predecessor, I suppose, you've got the greatest threat to democracy. Le Pen, okay, she didn't come close, but she pushed Macron a lot closer than many people predicted. I've seen alarming reports from France about the possibility of her winning next time round. So the greatest threat is where robust institutions, if you like, anti-establishment institutions existed anyway. And on the left, what you're seeing is, I think, in countries like France, where you don't have what would typically be called consensual societies, you're getting, rather than an emergence of a left-wing version of populism, rather a realignment. So a decline of old communist parties and a rise of groups like, you know, Mélenchon's, France Insoumise, etc. So I just want to, the other example here would be the UK, where you don't have any robust predecessor to a populist movement. And so while Farage has managed to do untold damage through the referendum, he hasn't got a party that's got a snowball's chance in hell of any electoral breakthrough and exercising any threat to democracy in the UK. I just wonder whether you could...
Yeah, no, that's great, thanks. I mean, on the consensus issue, I didn't really draw on any of that data. I mean, I suppose, I started off with Lipset and Roccan, and if you go back to, you know, 60s, 70s political science, which is, I guess, some of the stuff I was starting to read when I started as a PhD student, we were still talking about Aaron Leipard and so on. How to deal with divided societies was a live issue in political science in the post-war period because of the memory of what happened in the 30s and 40s, right? So if you think about some of the structural functionalism kind of political science of the 60s, a lot of it was about, there's this concept, I know at the time I thought, what's all this about? I don't really understand what they're getting at, but they talked a lot about concepts like integration. It was about holding societies together because of this experience of catastrophic social breakdown in the 30s and 40s. You know, democracy wasn't taken for granted, peaceful coexistence wasn't taken for granted. And so we had, you know, countries like the Netherlands, Leipard started off analyzing it as a deeply divided society that had to be held together through these institutions of consociationalism. And somewhere along the line, we just kind of assumed away the problem of trying to hold societies together, I think. And especially after 1990, when communism had ceased to be a threat, there's this idea that politics has to be all about, we can all agree on basic things like liberal democracy, capitalism, and, you know, a broadly sensible way of running, you know, central banks and doing taxing and spending and so on. And all of the life was sucked out of politics. And the conflict, you know, the potential for conflict was still there, right? And the more inequality rises, and, you know, I don't deny that cultural issues, that I don't regard them as an irrelevance. I just don't think they're the driver of all of this that some people think they are. But undoubtedly, increasing social cultural diversity resulting not only from migration, but also simply from the fact that generations have different values and so on. All of that is still there. But we had a set of political institutions that you know, ignored, you know, potential conflicts between homeowners and people who couldn't afford to buy a home, between pensioners with lots of, you know, assets and pensions, and young people with no social security and no financial assets or any prospect of getting them. All of that was, and also potentially conflicts between, you know, downtrodden, ethnically homogeneous areas, such as parts of South Wales, for example, that all of a sudden, for the first time in a century, have experience of migration, new citizens coming in and bringing something different with them. All of that creates the potential for conflict. If you then throw in a terrible financial crisis and then some idiotic austerity policies, frankly, into the mix, it's really not surprising that people are going to get angry, and then they're going to look for ways to try and interpret what's happening to them, and they're going to listen to people who say, I can solve your problem, you know, I can deal with this. So yeah, I think, I mean, I maybe overdo it in the book, denying the importance of culture, because it clearly is important. There are some people who are reasonably economically secure that still wanted to vote for Brexit, or in some European countries still vote for Le Pen and other far-right parties. And they do so because they don't like diversity. I'm not trying to deny that that is an element of what's going on here. But what I'm trying to argue in the book is that the way you explode that out of the basic 10 or 15% of people in any advanced society, which I think probably is basically racist and socially authoritarian, I think those people have been there all along. They would vote for the Conservatives. They would vote for, in France, the Gaullists. Now, because of the cartel dynamics of our politics, they are now lured into voting for something stronger. And Brexit was obviously the version of that in the UK. Yeah, so how do you put the cat back in the bag, I suppose, is the question. I think we just need to recognize that we don't agree on things, that the consensus before was illusory, and especially in a time of economic hard times, you know, and the economy's not growing, there's no point pretending we all agree that, you know, inflation at a certain rate and, you know, liberalizing markets is going to do it for everyone. That's obviously not going to work. We need to recognize that we disagree on things and find a way to deal with that democratically and without disorder and violence.
Thank you, and apologies for having to leave before the end, but thank you very much. Thanks for a fascinating talk. We'll sign off now. Thanks, Gordon.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks very much. And I don't know whether any other questions have come in. We've got about 7 minutes left. I've only got one thing I was going to ask. I could add, and it's just that I noticed you haven't mentioned, if you like, the climate emergency, and I realise that it's maybe not integral, but I wonder if that's going to be a factor. I mean, it's probably a divide, a left-right. You know, there's a divide on that issue. Is it real? Is it not real? Is it something to watch out for the future? Because when I saw the Corbyn's policies on for the global emergency and so on, they were radical, you know, and they were portrayed as such. But where's that going to take us in this crisis of market liberalism, if you like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, something else I didn't have time to put in the book, but I have no excuse in the case of climate change, because COVID I didn't see coming, but climate change was already around. I mean, climate change clearly can be put into these same. It can be, you know, it plays a similar role in our politics to austerity, migration, and these other contentious issues. The problem with climate change from the point of view of market liberalism is that market liberalism just doesn't have any theory of how you deal with the finite resources that capitalism draws on. So obviously, and there's no free market solution. There has to be regulation. I'm no expert on you know, whether, you know, carbon taxes work or how you regulate markets, but, you know, I know there are good ideas out there. I don't think it's a technological problem. I don't think we don't know how to deal with climate change. It's about the politics. It's about getting people to cope with change. And there are two dimensions to that. One is just getting people to cope with doing things differently. It's really hard, right? I own a car. Before the pandemic, I used to fly, you know, between 10 and 20 times a year. You know, it took the pandemic to stop me doing that. And it's really made me reflect a bit on whether I need to do it so much into the future. And I'm pretty sure something's going to change. I'm not going to be wasting emissions on going to the American Political Science Association conference anytime soon. But the other side of it is that it's costly, right? Some of the time it really costs you money. If you want to deal with this, you're going to have to make people, you know, either you're going to have to make fuel more expensive, or you're going to have to make people spend money insulating their homes. They're going to have to get around on a bike instead of driving everywhere. You know, now, I think the point about all of this, and I was reading something interesting about this, I think yesterday, Michael Mann was giving a talk somewhere, a climate scientist. I think it's about getting collective solutions to these problems. The real danger, I think, with market liberalism as an idea and as a philosophy is that it leaves the initiative down to the individual. The idea is that markets in which individuals interact and prices settle everything solves problems. It's not going to solve climate change, right? We need collective solutions. And what else is that going to mean except the government actually getting involved and doing things? It took the pandemic to turn central London into a place where it was pleasant to go for a walk. Seriously, you could just see in the first lockdown, it's not been quite the same this time around, but you could walk in the middle of the road safely. People got their bikes out. You saw children riding their bikes around London on London streets, just completely inconceivable. It's only because of the pandemic that we're able to do that. The thing is, we're going to have to do that now because of climate change. I'm a bit, we'll see how it goes. I'm a bit pessimistic that I think we have the wrong kind of government at the moment to be able to seize the opportunity. Needs to be somebody more radical whose votes are not largely from people who are not going to see climate change because they're too old. So I think we might miss the opportunity, but the opportunity is there. God, we could completely rejig the way in which we live, how we move around, how much we need to move around, where we do our shopping, where we work. It's revolutionary. If we try to just go back to where we were last February, it would be a massive missed opportunity, and the consequences are going to be a million miles worse than this pandemic for sure.
Thank you, Jonathan. Does anybody have any last questions? We've got 3 minutes left. Andrew, do you want to ask a last question? We've taken advantage of Jonathan's good nature already.
The only thing I was sort of thinking about, because you touched on this, was about the capacity really of capital to reproduce growth in the next decade. And, obviously, some of these things have been ticking time bombs in the capacity of capital to being unable to deliver that in the sort of the 90s, and people turn to personal credit as their own solution. These are all big ifs, but a capital that's unable to return to a kind of golden age of growth where we have very low growth in the next decade, combined with recovery from this crisis, combined with the impending climate crisis. I mean, I think you used the term perfect storm. It's a pretty terrifying prospect, that kind of combination. I just sort of, on a final cheery note, I thought, just any thoughts on that?
I mean, so I know it's hard for students attending these kind of talks to speak up on Zoom, and I also know it's straight after lunch, so we all feel a little bit less enthusiastic, but I hope the students listening in on this realize that it's on you lot. I mean, old geezers like us who probably not going to see the worst of this are not going to solve this for you. We're too complacent. Life has been too easy for us. And we're not going to have to deal with the worst of it. Although the way things are going, we're going to have to deal with it sooner than maybe we thought. But I mean, in the end, a lot of the rest of the stuff we talk about is almost meaningless compared to the size of this. And, if people under the age of, 30, 40 don't get to grips with it and get us older people to make sacrifices, because I don't see why we should expect the young to make all the sacrifices. One of the things that I think has escaped notice in British politics over the last few years, Brexit really pushed this shift hard. It was maybe happening already, but Brexit completely, threw petrol onto this fire. The generational divide in this country is astonishing. We have the biggest gap in voter turnout between young and old of any democracy. And when that happens, you can expect to have a government that is basically only going to listen to old people. From the climate change point of view, this is a total catastrophe because, my parents are in their 80s and frankly, they never talk about climate change. It's of no concern to them, not because they're bad people, but it's just something is not going to happen to you. It's not going to be top of your priority list. Well, unfortunately, those are the kind of people that the government listens to first. So, you young folk, get moving. do something.
Thanks, Jonathan. Those are very wise words. I hope everybody is listening, and we've got this, we're recording this, so let's hope it gets a lot of likes in the future as well, because those are really important words. So I think all that remains is for me to do 2 or 3 things. One is remind you that there's another talk on the 24th of March, and that involves Elena and others. 2 is to ask you to fill in a little survey. It's only a 2-question survey at the end of this talk. And 3 is to thank Elena, Andrew, and all of the attendees, and above all, Jonathan, for what was a stupendous talk, with it so broad-ranging and so, insightful. We really are grateful at a time when, frankly, we're all exhausted and we needed something to lift our spirits. And you've certainly cheered us up with those.
With my claims of impending doom.
Exactly. We're all doomed, as John Laurie used to say. So thank you so much, Jonathan. We're very, very grateful. We're going to send out a tweet after this, so you will see it in due course. So thank you very much, and thanks to all the attendees. And I'm going to stop the recording now. Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you very much for coming.